Happy Montag or Monday. Sorry.
You couldn't resist, could you?
How you doing, Andreas?
Very good, very good.
Good.
Thanks. Is it? I'm just seeing our big picture. I'm
Yeah.
not seeing you, by the way.
Oh, you
Is
will in a
that-
second.
Okay.
Yeah, as soon as I can get rid of it.
Wasn't
No,
sure.
I always do a talk over because there's a bit of a lag between the.
I wasn't
StreamYard.
sure.
Yeah, no, it'll actually just be the voiceover the entire time. So,
Cool.
Yeah. How you been?
Yeah, very good. It's for me. It's already 5 p.m. So my Monday is almost done.
Yeah, I was gonna say Guten Morgen, but I figured that would be maybe only applicable to Matt and I right now, and
Yeah.
others in the U.S. But
Yeah.
that's cool. Well, thanks for joining. Yeah, it's been a bit since we've had you on, so always stoked to chat with you about data engineering. What you been up to lately?
Always cool to talk to you guys. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm as before. I'm working on the academy, working on new courses, bringing new content, making it easier for people to get into data engineering, find a job.
It's awesome.
It's my journey right now. How's it called? My path.
Yeah.
And you?
It's
How's the book doing?
It's like a hero's journey.
Yeah.
Book's going well, man. Like we're just in the final, I would say 95% of it, which is also, I would say, the hardest 5% of writing it. So
Transformations, queries, like
because we're having to cover like all of the we were originally going to write it about data transformations. Like, well, like that kind of presupposes you know how queries work. It kind of presupposes that you know how data modeling works. And so, we just got a lot of input from people. We're like, just cover, a bunch of stuff. So chapters that we thought would be, 30 pages end up being 50, 60 pages. So it's a lot to think about. Now, I'm sure, you've written your own data engineering book. And I'm sure when you went through that, you're like, there's a lot to cover. So,
well, yeah, that's always the thing. You have to, and that's what I also see with the courses and what I see what people need to look into as like boil down to or narrow it down to the important bits.
Yeah.
Because you can't go into a rabbit hole everywhere.
No. There are some rabbit holes you still want to cover, like kind of general knowledge kinds of things that data engineers need to know. But yeah, you have to leave a lot on the cutting room floor, unless you want to write like Spark the Definitive Guide or something. Then you can go pretty deep. Yeah. But if you want to be general about data engineering, it's a really, really hard problem, which is what we're finding.
What do you think are some of the core things that a data engineer should know? In 2022.
Well, especially in 2022, I don't know. You have to always think of: are we talking about the basics, or are we talking about more of the advanced?
Wait, let's maybe focus the question on your kind of ball. How would you describe your audience and the people that I guess use your courses and content?
Yeah. It's for me, it's basically I have 3 categories. I have very often I have either data scientists who want to get into the engineering part because they need the engineering part because they're maybe in this small project and there are no data engineers, so they need to do the first data engineering part. Then very often lately I have data analysts actually who want to learn more. That fits to something in a second, and then I have either computer science students or somebody who's coming from a completely different area and wants to get into more of these topics. And for them, data science is a bit too much, or it's too much analytics, and they look for engineering.
That's really interesting.
That fits also to your first question, why I asked with the basics or the more higher up or more in-depth topics. You see a lot right now this shift, and I've talked recently with somebody about this, where you get into that area where you have the analytics people, the data analysts, and you have your engineering team, and there's this bridge in the middle that needs to be gapped, where there's this new how's it called, analytics engineer. You hear that a lot more right now. Maybe that's something that actually gets more traction in the next few months or this year, I guess.
That's interesting. I mean, from your perspective, what is the skill set for analytics engineering? The domain seems to be evolving so fast. I mean, it definitely overlaps with data engineering, but then you tend to get into things like DBT or Looker as sort of your, what would you call it, Joe? The metric layer? What were you call it? I think you mentioned this last night.
Oh yeah, just like a metrics layer and stuff. Yeah, but I think, but I mean, it's interesting because tools like DBT, for example, and I would say before that Looker. I mean, I could argue DBT maybe took some inspiration from what Looker was doing, but it was really coming up with a layer where you could just define things once and reuse everywhere, right? And so, but analytics engineering is sort of an interesting title. Like I sort of take exception with it in some ways, because it's, in a lot of ways, it's not that much different than what maybe a BI or engineer was doing back in the day, or so it's maybe a modern twist. It maybe you integrate like software engineering principles in it, but it's
I don't know. The thing is, what I hear from my students, and I had a few coaching students in the last round who actually were data analysts, and they were saying like, yeah, we're data analysts. The problem is, with the data that we're working on, where we're creating the reports, that's already in some views that are prepared for us. And very often we would need actually more data, but there is no one and we know it's there, but there is no one to actually get that into views or into the right form where we can work with it. And I think that's, Matt, as you said, that's where the analytics engineer is coming into play to bridge that gap, where the data engineer, when you look at it classically, the data engineer comes in, drops the stuff in that it gets into a staging table in the warehouse, and then, okay, job done.
Yeah, like a lot of the plumbing too, to get it in, right? So it's like setting up all the infra and stuff. And I think that's,
then somebody needs to actually prepare stuff for the analyst, or the analysts actually do both. So I think that's a bit more coming a bit more into style right now.
It seems to be. There's definitely a path towards, like, for analysts, like democratizing the work of an analyst so that they aren't so reliant upon an engineer to do the work, right? If you use DBT, I can just write my transforms in there and be done using nothing but SQL, which an analyst is very familiar with. And so, having to rely on the BI engineer to write, like, slowly changing dimensions in your data warehouse, I think, at least if you're using certain tools, it's a lot simpler now. So, cool. Actually got a question here from Tanush, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. What are the skills one should focus on in order to become a data engineer? Have at it, guys.
Matt, do you want to go?
Sure. Let's see.
Got it.
Yeah. So I think our take in the book is that you really need to understand the life cycle. So you need to understand how data flows and then the business problems before you start doing anything else. And learning things like Spark or BigQuery or Snowflake, that's still important. But if you focus on those things first, then you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. It's like, okay, I'm going to learn how to use a wrench, and I'm going to learn how to use spark plug pullers, but I actually don't know what a car is. That tends to be the approach to data engineering we see right now. And so I would say, like, try to understand what businesses actually do with data and just understand how the role works, and then get into the details of tools afterward.
Yeah, I agree. It's you should have a good foundation, that you know how to code, that you know how to write SQL queries, and then it comes to the play, just like you said. Okay, what's the problem at hand? What should be the solution, or what should be the outcome? And then let's build something in between that fits. And for there, you should understand a few, let's say, important tools. When you think of, okay, in the OLAP, OLTP, what's ETL, ELT, the differences? How can you build this with a few basic tools? And then once you do this, then you can very often switch out the tools, and it still works. Right?
Yeah, I think it's so important, Andreas and Matt. It's like, focus on the fundamentals, because unless you understand really the fundamentals, I think we see too often people get focused on the tools, and that sort of replaces the notion of data engineering. But if you step back, right, if you understand how distributed systems work at kind of a fundamental level, if you understand how databases work at a fundamental level, right, and operating systems and so forth, I think it just gives you a much better context to understand how to apply that to the data lifecycle that you'll be. And I think it also forces you to ask better questions, right? Because you're not just shoehorning your business question into, well, like, can I do that in Spark? Because if I can't, then I'm kind of like screwed, right? Whereas if you took a step back and it's like, well, understand, okay, so what would be now that I understand the problem, what's the right tool or tools to solve this problem? But you only understand that, I think, once you do, I would say, to you guys' point, understand things at a more fundamental level. But it's hard, right? Because there's just a lot to know. So
yeah,
I did that a lot with my coaching students, where whenever we had a data set and we started actually like setting up a project, okay, set the goals. How are we going to access the data? What do we want to do? And then the first part was, I always say, okay, now let's build an ER model for a typical database, for a relational database. Let's see how this looks if you do it with a traditional tool, and then try to figure out where are the problems in this, what tool could solve this problem. Right? So I think that's super important, this skill. But do you need the fundamentals for that?
And I think a thing we see repeatedly, and we've been seeing it for like the last 10 or 15 years, is just overly complicated solutions. And I think one of the goals of good engineering should be kind of like form follows function, make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. In other words, what are you trying to accomplish? Create a solution that accomplishes that without a lot of extra bells and whistles that actually make it more expensive to maintain, harder to expand, harder to improve. And so I think if you focus first on the function, first on what you're trying to accomplish for the business, that becomes easier.
Yeah, the challenge too is just the tendency for data engineers and engineers in general to want to engineer.
Yes.
Right. It's literally in your title. So it's like, geez, do I simplify it or do I engineer stuff? Because if I'm not engineering, then am I doing my job, or should I keep engineering? And I think this is a classic conundrum that I think all of us are tempted to go into. It's like, well, but what if I just add like one more thing here? And that becomes like 15 more things or something. So it happens a bit, right? So he actually has a follow-up question here, Tanesh. Good questions here. He says he has work experience working with Transact SQL, ETL pipelines, using SQL Server integration services, data warehouse, data marts, and database administration. Will that be helpful if we're looking for data engineering jobs in the US? I would say that you can get a job. It depends on the type of company you're looking at, right? So I don't know if this would be a job or this would be a skill set where you could get a job at maybe more of a kind of a data first, tech first startup, for example. But the skill set's highly applicable to a lot of, I would say, more mature companies where there's a lot of SQL Server. But I would recommend maybe moving, trying to because it seems like you have a good basis, but trying to augment your skills with maybe some cloud-based solutions, Snowflake, for example, or BigQuery, and kind of more maybe modern data pipeline tools. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's my take as well. Yeah, SQL Server is still extremely popular. Like if you want, starting today, you could make your entire career off of SQL Server. I'm pretty sure. I don't think it's going away, but I think it's definitely worth your while to learn some of the new and exciting tools that, actually Snowflake is not even that new anymore, but these more modern approaches with highly scalable columnar data warehouses that separate compute and storage. And that will at least give you more diverse skill set as you're job hunting. And you might also go play around with some tools and see what you actually like using, because you are going to spend a lot of time with all of these tools. And so maybe at the end of the day, you do just want to do SQL Server stuff, but go see what's out there, play around with it, get some experience with Snowflake, BigQuery, Spark to some extent, and then, put those things on your resume once you have that baseline.
Also depends a bit, as you said, Joe, with the company. This sounds like a job This sounds like a person where that fits to a job description of a company running a analytics platform for their business processes or whatever, and where you have a lot to do with data warehouses, where you have locally, it can also be in the cloud, but locally from within the company, data coming into relational databases that needs to be drawn out and put into a warehouse and so on. So that's something where this what this sounds a lot like. This could be something for you. On the other hand, if you have a startup that's building their day-to-day pipelines, their day-to-day, their main use case might be a bit difficult to get into.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because we're seeing a lot of startups using kind of more, I would say, more modern data tools. Even for databases like Firebolt and Rockset come to mind as something that's like used for data applications, right? Like a customer needs a data-powered app, for front-facing analytics, probably going to go towards something like that. So I would say like you have a good basis for sure, and it's like you have the skills to use these sorts of tools. I would argue that the world's gotten easier in some ways because the tools have become more abstract. So like if you know how to use SSIS, like I'm pretty sure you could figure out how to use Fivetran and DBT, for example. I'd be willing to bet money on that. So, but I would say things like data marts and so forth, those are still used in some types of applications, but I'd say increasingly it's becoming less and less common to see those out in the wild with newer, I would say newer projects that are started. Obviously, if the company has built a data mart, they're probably going to keep using a data mart. But good question though, and it's the U.S. is a very big place too. It's I would say the answer to your question overall is yes, because there's millions of companies in the U.S., so I'm sure one of them will be able to hire you for that.
Yeah. So. But look especially for the job description. Is this a job where you work on an analytics platform?
Yeah,
maybe. But you mentioned Rockset. I found that very interesting. A few weeks ago, I actually looked into that.
I saw that. Yeah, it's awesome.
And what I really liked is that way of, okay, I have my data and let's just create like a view, but it's an API. So you can very easy host your data as an API and make it accessible. Whereas earlier you always had to like go through that extra hoop of, okay, now I need to create an API for that and set everything up. And that I really like that. Disclaimer, I just like tried it with the example project, but I think that's a really cool way of doing it, of thinking of how to make data accessible.
Oh, side note, expect somebody from Rockset's going to be on the Monday Morning Data Chat in a few weeks, I believe.
Cool.
So yeah, we got a Shruti buddies from there. She's awesome. So yeah, stay tuned for that announcement, which I just kind of announced actually. So anyway,
it's too late now.
More officially. Yeah. So actually, Mike Nash, what's up, Mike? He's over in across the pond, actually, more in the UK, I think, kind of your neck of the woods, Andreas. He asked, with data engineering, the landscape can change all the time. Do you advocate doing live projects, quote unquote, as a great way to learn the latest methods in a commercial setting? I'm not sure what you mean by live.
I'm also not sure.
But yeah, do everything in production for sure. Just kidding. If you could elaborate what you mean by live, that would be helpful. But I guess maybe a broader question would be, how do you advocate if you're at a company? How do you learn things on the job? Maybe is a different approach to this question.
Without drifting into pure resume-driven development at the same time, right? Like what's...
Yeah, and I kind of strawmanned his argument, by the way, because I just redid it. But yeah, what were you saying, Matt?
Oh, just I mean, learning on the job is very important, but I think I've seen lots of teams drift off into just chasing shiny objects, basically, without actually contributing that much to the companies they're working for. So it's kind of this balancing act of like bringing in helpful technology, not getting stagnant, but also not just chasing things that aren't actually useful to your employer, at least during work hours.
I think it always also depends a bit on. I'm still stuck with the live projects.
Yeah.
Like, is this for at work, that you use it at work, or just for interest? There's a lot of stuff changing. Let's do it. And live is more like, okay, I'm going to set something up for myself. Like I recently, and I'm actually going to turn this into a course. I was thinking of, okay, what could be a use case for Elasticsearch, because I want to get a bit more into Elasticsearch. What could I do? And then I was thinking, okay, let's get a data set from Yelp with businesses. Let's have customers make some like purchases or scanning at the place, and then let's put this all into Elasticsearch, and then let's see who went where and where did they go before that, and so on, and let's show this on map with let long. And it's really cool, and this way you can, I mean, with a Docker container, it's super easy to set everything up.
Yeah.
And then you have a live project at hand where you say, okay, this is not just in a book.
That's sick.
I did this, and it's actually.
I think that'd be great, because for data people especially, I mean, Elasticsearch's been around for a while, but we come across, people would hit us up saying, "Oh, can you help us with our Elasticsearch?" And we're like, "Maybe. Tell me more about that." And so then you realize they for a while they've been using their Elasticsearch cluster as a data warehouse, doing aggregations, and we're like, you might want to stop that soon, because it's not going to get better with time. So please address anti-patterns as well if you do this course. But I think it's a necessary course. So Mike actually clarifies his question here. Yes, commercial work or live work examples. Can this help, or is it better to learn theory first? Maybe less risky. I think you could do work examples, live examples. Maybe don't have it against your production database, especially if you're doing any writes or reads or updates or deletes, or heavy reads on the system. But sure, why not? One thing I would advocate too is kind of setting aside some time where you maybe if you're fortunate your company will allow this, maybe set aside some time where you can learn new stuff. Like we do that for our employees. Like we intentionally set aside Fridays where we have a study group, and they have to learn new stuff. That's kind of part of the job. But I think we're a rare example, because like knowledge is also something that you kind of need in this business. If you don't have it, then it's easy to go stale, right? So I would say as long as it's applicable to what you plan to work on. I'll give you an example of maybe something that wouldn't be a great idea. Like I had a friend of mine the other day hit me up and say that the team that they were on wanted to, and this is a team of data engineers, they wanted to move everything to TypeScript. In which case I just sort of like vomited in my mouth and said, like, I think that's a really horrible idea in any universe. So anyway, but so there's things like that where you're just like, that's, I guess if you want to waste your time doing that, go for it. So,
but I think that is a bit in contradiction what Matt said earlier, or what you two are saying earlier with your book, where you're coming from, that you're more coming from understand what you want to do and then focus on tools, right? And this, can I get into the newest tools with live work for commercial? That, for me, that implies that I have that tool that I want to apply, and so I'm going to find myself something that where I'm using it, which is actually the other way around again. So
it could be perceived that way for sure.
Yeah.
I think maybe the distinction is like trying to learn, like, I think focusing on, what's core to you, as well as maybe keeping your eye on the periphery for new things that kind of come out of left field. Like Roxette, like you brought up that example, right? Like that's definitely not mainstream these days, but it's one of those things where you're keeping your eye on it. Because it's like, the way technology moves too is you got to be looking at not just what your use case is today and how you're approaching it, but also what's coming down the horizon, that's going to be popular in 2-3 years that you might want to be paying attention to. So maybe that's the distinction. Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear. Because we definitely, on the surface, it sounded like we contradict ourselves, but we do that all the time. This is the Monday morning hypocrisy show. Yeah, we're just all about just giving horrible advice. So use TypeScript for everything. It's a great cutting edge data engineering language. So I'm just kidding. But if you want to use TypeScript, I don't really care. It's what you
do what you want to do.
Do what you want to do.
I guess my take would be, if you've identified a use case for something, so say Roxette, the really great thing in 2022 is that it's so easy to turn things on. And we try to emphasize this all the time with our clients, both in terms of trying new technologies where they're maybe considering 5 different technologies to solve a particular problem, or where they need to scale something they already have. And it's like, just go turn it on. Just try these 5 things. Yeah. Don't waste too much time. Try to be focused, but go in and just do some experimentation and see how they behave against. When we say live, of course, you have to be careful. You have to be ethical, but you can simulate data streams off of the data that you actually own. You can simulate your production traffic so you can see how these systems will behave. And again, the same thing with scaling. It's like, well, how much do I need to scale my MariaDB? Just go try it out. Turn on a separate MariaDB, try some workloads on it, see what happens, then you can adjust your production once you kind of know what you're dealing with. So I think in that respect, and this is something I would emphasize for data engineering learners as well. I think a lot of older books still tend to emphasize like, hey, you can do all this in your laptop, which is great, but just go do it in the cloud. It's even easier because there's less configuration. You're not going to screw up your local environment. Just turn things on, try out databases, try out these technologies, get your hands dirty. Once you've, again, we want to emphasize like you need to understand the life cycle, but at some point you do need concrete exposure to technologies, and you can do that even if you don't work for a company, which is a really great thing now.
I think for companies, yes, I would use stuff in the cloud because you're not paying for it and like. But for what I see also for learners, sometimes it's good to just have a Docker container that you run on your local machine, and it costs nothing and
it's cheaper.
Sandbox.
Exactly. Have a sandbox to play around. But I would also say it's a good suggestion.
Yeah, do both. I would say, like Docker's really good, especially if you can localize stuff that's like a Spark cluster, right? Like Spark's easy to learn on your computer. Sure, you can just like pip install it actually with PySpark,
right,
but
exactly.
or Trino or whatever. Like maybe try and use Docker first. Totally agree. Because spinning that up in the cloud, it will cost you money. And then the dangerous thing is when you forget to turn off your cluster, then you wake up the next morning and you're like, I'm bankrupt now.
Yeah. You got to be careful with all of this. Yeah,
it'll be annoying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely did that before.
It's happened to us too. So.
Matt Yamra. What's up, Matt? He was on the show last week. He kind of is a definition of the analytics engineer maybe suited to a pretty large shop that has the demand to need someone or some group doing that exclusively. What do you guys think? I actually saw an analytics engineer pop up more kind of along kind of the smaller companies, startup stage of companies, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this.
I almost feel like if you're really small, then maybe an analytics engineer can handle most of the life cycle. What do you think, Joe? I think we see this sometimes where it's like...
Well, we see this
all the time. Yeah. And it's like, I want to automate some stuff we're doing in Excel, basically. It's like, all right, turn on Snowflake or BigQuery and just get the data flowing in that right now is dropping onto people's laptops and start running SQL queries on a schedule, generating reports. Like, I feel like that's something potentially an analytics engineer can do end to end as long as it's not too terribly complicated.
The question is always, do you have really one person that is just doing that?
Yeah.
I don't think generally this is the case. Very often you have also not a data engineer who's doing just data engineering. So it's like you have a scientist who's also doing data engineering, or you have the analyst who's also doing the analytics engineer role, or a data engineer who is also doing the machine learning engineer stuff. It's flowing. I think a lot of people like try to think of just this narrow path that you can't look left or right. It's not that.
Yeah, I would say in big shops too, titles are sort of it's sort of vague anyway, right? Because at some point, like I think titles get a lot more specific as your company grows, just because your needs get a lot more specific and you have to have higher specialization dedicated to tasks. And so I would say that what the definition of an analytics engineer at a larger company might actually differ from that of an early stage startup, for example. And so because you're not going to be a jack of all trades, you're going to be like the jack of like a pipeline probably that you're responsible for, and that's about it. So good question though. Mark Keeling, what's up, Mark? Yes, what are the biggest hurdles for most data engineering teams to overcome? Oh, this is a juicy question. Have fun, guys.
It depends a lot on the company and the leadership. I think a lot of problems come from management and from leadership. That is like, okay, we want to build this. And then people see the engineering bills, or at some point they need to understand it's going to cost us in engineering. Oh, engineering, does that even deliver us value? Oh, let's save some money on that. And that's one of the biggest hurdles I I experienced over the years. It's always, when it comes to the engineer, when it comes to the bits and bolts, people like to keep it small because it's not producing direct output. I don't know. What do you think?
Two spring to mind, but Joe may have some other ideas. I think one is that often data engineering teams get pretty divorced from the rest of the business and just kind of collect data for its own sake. People don't actually use it, and they're not actually feeding data science or analytics or doing anything useful. We've seen that a lot. The other thing that frequently happens is that data engineering teams can get stuck in a rut where there are opportunities to evolve and improve the data stack, but they're just kind of stuck on one very particular tech stack that they babysit and maintain and maybe tweak just a little bit, occasionally add an ETL pipeline, but they're really not able to do anything new, even though there are new opportunities with data that aren't being realized and maybe new possibilities for systems and scalability.
But what would you say is the reason for that? What have you?
I'm kind of using, so it's hard to even define sometimes what a data engineer is, but I'm thinking of like the very traditional corporate environment where you frankly have talented people. You have these DBAs and ETL developers, but they're just kind of stuck on like a very old data warehouse system. And to your point earlier, Andreas, about costs, the business doesn't want to spend the money that it would take to do a cloud migration, for example. Not realizing that if I can get into the cloud, on the one hand, the cloud can be a sandbox where I just waste a lot of time, right? You could become that kind of data engineering team that doesn't actually deliver value. But if you have the right business goals, it's a place where you can build a lot of interesting and useful things. But they just don't want to make that leap to get into the cloud, to spend the money and resources up front to do it. And so they're stuck on some really ancient, transactional system that doesn't scale, where they're storage constrained, they're resource constrained, they can't really do anything interesting. They're constantly fighting with the amount of CPU available. Like we've seen this again and again.
But I think these are all symptoms of a bigger problem, though, and the problem is the organization itself, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it adopting data in a way that's driving the business forward, or I guess a distinguishing question is really, does the company see data as a cost center or as a profit center? So I think a lot of things sort of evolve from that question, right? So if it's seen as a cost center, then basically the company's on defense every single time when it comes to data and any projects. If you're seeing data as an asset and a profit driver, you're willing to make the investments, give the data team the support they need. And so I would say that it really does come from outside factors. The things that data engineers have to deal with, I think, they're on the receiving end of stuff typically, and you're basically doing what you can to work within those constraints, right? So if you're a data engineer at like a tech forward company, a tech native company, it's going to be a lot easier to, I would say, make advancements in your domain, in your job, than it would be if you're at Dunder Mifflin or something like that, or Vernam Hogg for the people in the UK. But some kind of backwards company that's kind of stuck in the Stone Age. So but these hurdles can be overcome because you can just leave these companies and go somewhere else now. So it's not like you're stuck here.
Yeah. The thing is, as you said, like if you, I don't like. I have a bit of problem with the companies looking at the data or the engineering as the profit center, or the data as profit center, because very often it is super hard to actually tie a profit number to what's going on.
It can be, for sure, especially if you're internal facing. Like this is like if you're just making reports, like what's the value of the report? So
and so then it becomes, very often it becomes like do I have the right strategy for this, and are people believing in this, and do they want to spend the money for it?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And if they lose the trust, or if they don't believe in it anymore, then it's dead in the water.
For sure. Actually, Matt and I were talking about this last night. We were talking about sort of this whole notion that data needs to bring value to the business, right? And you unpack that a bit. So you tell me, like, other industries where they have to constantly scream about how much value they're adding. So when you talk to a plumber, it's not like a plumber says, I add a lot of value to, things, right? They're just like, your pipes work or they don't. And if they don't, things happen. Or like an accountant in a business, right? Or like finance. It's like, Do you add value to the business? Unequivocally, yes. Because if you don't have those functions, things aren't getting paid. So bad decisions are getting made, or no decisions getting made. And so, but data is interesting where, I see this a lot on LinkedIn, like data needs to add value to the company. And I'm like, if you have to scream it that hard, there's how much value are you adding? Right. Like if you have to, it's just about, it's a constant thing. If you have to keep reminding somebody of something, then it's like, well, does it actually matter or doesn't it? And I'm not saying either way, but I think to your point, Andreas, it gets a lot fuzzier in companies where data is definitely an internal focused activity where, like Google or Uber, for example, data is the product basically. Like, these applications run on these large amounts of fast moving data. Like that literally is embedded in the DNA of the product. But if you're a paper manufacturer, for example, unless you've embedded workflows, and kind of modernized yourself, if you're just going off of like reports out of like crystal reports or something from some legacy system, then it's like you could make a pretty strong argument value is very ambiguous in that case. Yeah. I guess the question is, what happens if you don't do anything?
For a lot of people, it stays as it is, and that's it.
Yep,
and then
exactly
wasted opportunities. But
yeah, on that positive note, geez, well, the Monday morning existential dread chat.
The Monday morning dragging everyone down.
All right, cool. Well, let's go to a different one. Toiling in Obscurity, great fitting name based upon our last chat. But Toiling in Obscurity asks, can you please explain what exactly a data lake is and useful for in a way to help me weasel my way out of using it just because my manager says so? Two-part question. What is a data lake? And then help me weasel my way out of using it because my manager says so. That's not really a question. It's more of a statement. But
it's a request, I think.
It's a request, yeah.
Existential crisis, basically.
I don't know.
What's a data lake? I don't know.
I'm more stuck on the second part. Just because the manager says so. It's a bad reason to use something when you
generally.
We'll answer the first part of your question. I think the advice maybe for the second part is that's up to you. What is a data lake though?
Should I go?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I think people very often they make this more complicated as it is, and like show we have our data lake, but in the back end it's just like on AWS S3 where they drop the files in the buckets or in folders in buckets, and that's the data lake. So people make this very often a big deal. It's actually something super simple, right? So I think the usefulness usually comes for me, and whenever I saw that always when you want to run some analytics on top of like all your data that you have, or where you want to keep the original data as a archive or a history where you can then basically use it again. That's stuff where this is very good with the right tools. You have all your data there, you know the format, you know what it is. Let's go through with whatever, Spark or other tools, and let's use that data again in a very cheap way.
Yeah, I think there's probably two phases to the data lake too. I think there's like data lake 1.0, which we call it in a book, which is like kind of the data dump, just dump everything into S3, for example. And to me, that's no different than dumping your data into like SharePoint back in the day. Like it's a repository of stuff. It looks like my garage right now, which is another disaster. But you kind of fast forward, kind of data lake 2.0, some vendors like Databricks might call it the lake house or something. But I think the notion is, especially for semi-structured or structured data, give it structure, treat it like a database, right? So have some form of transaction handling, ACID compliance, storage, and so forth. So I would say under that paradigm, the distinction of a data lake, it's becoming very murky when you compare it to a data warehouse, for example, because they both have the notion of separate compute and storage, right? And like the ability to perform queries, using sort of a polyglot of different tools, whether that's Python or SQL or whatever. And so, the data lake 2.0, the lake house, it's a bit different. Companies like Upsolver, I think, are doing a fantastic job at putting a great storage engine on a data lake that allows you to read data from really really fast and so forth. And so it's just with the data lake 1.0, I think that definitely still happens. And if you wanted to weasel your way out of using that, I would say maybe pull up a picture of a garbage dump or a swamp, and then pull up a picture of a data lake, kind of the older version, and just say which one of these looks like the other. And so, because this is what you will get if we use data lake, kind of the earlier version of it. But under the new paradigm, though, I'd say you're actually really good to go. So hopefully your boss is listening to that part too. So.
Yeah, and focus. I mean, I think Data Lake 2.0 has kind of been realized in two different ways, Joe, which I think you alluded to this, but cloud data warehouses reproduce a lot of these same features, which is, it's not like the old on-prem days where you only have so much disk and you run out of disk and you're done. That used to always be the problem, and that's why you couldn't store the raw data, to Andreas's point. And now you can. Not all raw data can go into a cloud data warehouse, but anything semi-structured can. You can have thousands of columns in a table in many cases. You can put mass volumes of raw text into...
You can put images and video too. You can pretty much put anything in there.
At some point, you probably don't want to anymore, like binary files at some point.
Like executable, like Windows exe files or something. Like...
But then maybe those shouldn't go into a data lake either. So,
yeah. Data that you can query, basically, whether it's images or video, even you can query that, right? Like, it's a bit of a different query pattern, but you can query it. So, but yeah, good question. Good luck with your manager too. What's that, Andreas?
That's just to add something to it. That it needs to be, whenever you use the data lake, you need to have a use case in mind for that.
Yep.
And I think that's what you're talking also with data lake version 2, where you not just dump everything in it. It'll be fine. But okay, this is data where I want to do something with it. And the most efficient way of using or storing and then later using it is in a data lake. And that's the right reason. So it's okay if the boss says you need to use the data lake if that makes sense to the use case. If that doesn't make sense, then
find out what the use case is. That's maybe ask your boss what's the goal? What are we trying to do?
What's the if the boss says we use the data lake, we just want to keep the raw data forever, we just use it as our archive, just use it for that. Okay, fine.
Easy.
That's it. That's the right way.
Got a question here from Patik. Can you guys suggest some books so we can get good knowledge in data engineering field as a fresher? Andreas, I think you wrote a book.
Yeah, I stopped plugging my
Okay, never mind.
I think it's the thing with my cookbook is, and you can find that also on my website. I need to update it. I haven't updated it for 2 years, and so much has happened until then, since then. So I actually don't know. For me, I also don't learn with books, and with my academy, I do everything. I try it out. I don't have books. I'm not the book guy. Books are great for, okay, I'm like back in the days when I was working on Hadoop. Okay, I have the Hadoop book. If I run into a problem or something, I'm going to go back to the book and like find the right chapter and read up on it, and that's it. But for doing such a hand-on, like, I hope
we'll talk
maybe
about
in a few,
but books are tricky in data engineering right now. I say books are really tricky because by the time they go to print, there's a very good risk that the book might be out of date, right? I mean, things are changing. So, I mean, because you want to, especially if you're looking at a technical manual, like Hadoop, for example, it would need to be, constantly cycled through and revised. And I would say, like, try and find a digital version of a book if you're looking at a technical manual, just because it can be updated more frequently. I think your approach with the GitHub book is fabulous, actually, because it was just, you can update it doing Git pushes. I mean, that's pretty cool. The book we're writing, the challenge. So for because you check out the Fundamentals of Data Engineering by Joe Reis and Matt Housley, coming out in O'Reilly later this year. But the challenge with the book when we started writing it is, okay, how do you avoid writing a tools focused book, right? That's, as Andreas points out, this is actually a very difficult thing to do in this field where it changes at light speed. We had to really unpack everything and decide, okay, so we're going to focus on things that are probably not going to change in 5 years. Maybe more, maybe less, but the whole thing is like data lifecycle. Like that's probably not going anywhere, at least to some degree. It's not going to move as fast as, say, if you wrote a book on like Trino, right? Like that's, by the time this goes to print, there's some things that will possibly be outdated. And so, but I think a really good book that I think stands the test of time is Martin Kleppmann's Designing Data Intensive Applications. I was actually reading a bit of it yesterday, and that is a fantastic book. It's 5 years old. I think it was published in 2017. One of the best books I would say on at least distributed systems engineering ever written. And it still is relevant to this day for the most part. I know there's talk that might be updated, but can't say for sure. But I contrast that really quick with some other books I was reading over the weekend. So I was actually reading Bill Inman's Data Warehouse 2.0 because I wanted to dive deep into kind of some old school data modeling techniques. And that book, I would say, it was a good reference for the time. I don't know that a lot of the techniques would be as relevant today because things have changed. His paradigm was really focused on storage as sort of a central consideration, and moving things to lifecycle tiers and storage. I think it's a good idea, but that's just very much, it's just easier these days. And storage is so cheap, does it really matter? So yeah, I would say there's good books out there. But I think Andreas' point, though, I think the evolution is really going towards video, actually. And that's what we see.
I like that you moved into that direction with the book, that you didn't make it like tool specific, because that is actually something that is missing. As you see, like this is a pretty simple question, right? What books do we suggest to get into data engineering? This should be, but there's not really a book out there.
No,
so I like it that you guys focused on like bringing up from the fundamentals and not making it, okay, to become a data engineer, you need to learn this and this and this.
And those graphs drive me crazy because half the stuff like pig or whatever is on there, and you're like, I don't know anyone who's using that and hasn't used it for like 10 years. But it was tricky, talking to our publisher, because you're just like, you realize this is a very difficult book to write, and there's a reason nobody's like written it yet. Because it's hard. The moment because to your point, it's, I think that Matt and I both feel like we knew it. We thought we knew data engineering when we started writing this, and then we're like, we don't know anything actually. It's hard. I think there's a lot of still gaps that we don't know. I mean, I'm talking to people all the time about data engineering and new paradigms and stuff, and I just feel like the more I learn, the more I don't actually know much. And I would say that's kind of a weird statement from somebody who's writing a book, but it's every day more feels like you're approaching things from like a beginner's mind, so to speak, because it's just, there's so much going on right now in the space. So yeah, it's a good question. Walk us through what you're working on, though. I mean, you got some courses. I mean, you want to give a plug for what you're doing? And
I actually, that fits to what we were talking just now. I actually looked into Python for data engineers.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you, I was actually thinking about that in terms of baselines as we were talking about that earlier. Yeah, tell us more.
So, because I was thinking, or I had the problem that people were always asking me, Andreas, what Python should I know to start becoming a data engineer or start your academy? And I always had to like point them to other sources. Where the problem, and I told you this before we started with the live stream, the problem is, if we send someone away, then they are going down a rabbit hole. The Python rabbit hole as well is endless, and most of the stuff you don't need. You may need it later when you're like you're working on something. Here comes a problem, but it's not something that not everything that have to know before you start or when you start out. So I was looking through that, and I was I was thinking, okay, what topics actually do you need? And we have already a course for Python beginners. Amit created this, not me, other creator. And then I said, okay, let's move one further, not just a general Python course, but something where we're going adding more stuff like exception handling and logging and stuff. Like it's all pretty basic, but I think it's very important to talk about the basics that you come from. Okay, now you are going to start developing code. You're going to start developing programs. What are you going to do? And exception handling, logging, then the typical data engineering stuff where you have to struggle with some date time, and you're struggling with the formats and a lot with JSON. Like JSON right now is everywhere, coming from APIs, coming from logs, everywhere. JSON validation, unit testing, this kind of stuff, I think is very important for a data engineer to actually do. And then of course pandas. Yeah. Let me quickly go to my list. And then working with sources and things. That you can work with an API, that you understand how easy is it to work with an API. I have a separate API course, but for beginners, just the basics.
That's awesome.
And with databases, that you understand, okay, how can you use the right library to talk to a Postgres database. And this, I mean, to begin, it's not very complicated. You just need to look at a few areas, and then you can add more stuff to it. But I was thinking a lot, and I did a live stream on this where we thought about, okay, what should be in that course, and I think it's a good collection of stuff.
Jay Guzman asks, are you going to focus on PyTest for unit testing?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah,
that's really needed. I mean, I think there's Python's an interesting one too, because it's a simple language on the surface, but there's a lot of gotchas with Python. I think that all of us have run into. Dependency management, if you could do something on that would be fantastic, because I think Matt and I have run into many situations of Python dependency hell, and that is not fun at all. Python's a great language, I would say, except the two things that kind of irritate me about it is like definitely dependency management, to a lesser extent the global interpreter lock, but that's definitely a conversation for another day. But the dependency management is something that we just see people get spend a lot of time going through that. It's tough. So
especially with Airflow, I've got to admit, it can be so painful to manage dependencies in Airflow sometimes. So I think the other thing that's important to emphasize is that the skill set, the Python skill set that you need for data engineering is different from this Python skill set you need for data science. And I think that gets lost sometimes. And I think one of the headaches is that most of the data Python content is about data science. And I agree, like Pandas is a good thing for data engineers to know, but like you were saying, they need to know API access. They need to know, there are kind of two main API skills actually they need to know. One is pulling data. So in other words, if someone hands you a SaaS platform and says, hey, go get data from the SaaS platform, you have to figure out how to do that, unless you have some automated tool that will do it for you, which often there are just so many different SaaS platforms, nothing exists. So you need to go figure that out. And then second is just communicating for control. So controlling cloud services, controlling Snowflake, controlling Google Cloud, AWS, whatever it is. Data engineers need to get really good at that. And then orchestration. And so that's coming back to Airflow. And actually there are several interesting orchestration platforms. They're all basically based on Python these days. And even the concept of orchestration is something that might be a bit foreign to you if you come from a data science background. Like, what is orchestration? Why should you even care? Why shouldn't you just script everything yourself?
Yeah. Well, a lot of data scientists want to the tendency is to write stuff in notebooks. And so that's sort of, that's your interface, it's your IDE. So when it comes to orchestrating stuff, I actually had somebody ask, can I run Airflow within a notebook? And I'm like, I don't know. Do you want to do that? So, I mean, theoretically you probably could, but I don't know what it would really accomplish from an orchestration standpoint. So it's just, I think getting, the difference to me is like getting yourself out of the notebook and into, sort of a proper, Python, folder structure, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? So these are kind of lost arts in some way. We're actually talking about this in our study group on Friday. We're talking about just sort of that translating notebooks over to just Python scripts, something that back in the day everyone did before notebooks. Like if you wanted to write Python interactively, you would use the REPL, right? And that was kind of what you do. But or IPython, but to a large extent that's been replaced, and nothing wrong with that. That's how it is. Things evolve. So actually, I got a question for you, Andreas, because it might give you a chance to plug your recruiting aspect. Andreas, how to apply for data jobs in Europe, especially in Germany?
You have to apply. No, it's especially in Germany, I think it's easier because there are not so many engineers right now here in Germany. So in Europe / Germany, it's fairly easy usually to get a job, because they're, compared to if you want a data scientist job, it's a lot easier because there are not so many people. One thing, especially for Germany, and I think also like France and so on, the problem was always if you didn't understand, or if you don't understand the language. That's a big problem. It used to be before everybody was working from home, because within the office there are a lot of discussions, and if you don't know the language, people are going to with each other are going to talk in German or in French, and then you're basically missing out on everything, and you can never really participate just like that in a discussion. So that is something that you should not overlook. That's something important. I don't know how it is right now with everybody working from home, but yeah.
Do you want to give any plugs for recruiting avenues or anything like that?
Well, for my students, what I do for my students is right now I'm trying to help them get a job. This year in January, I started a recruiting service where for every academy member, they can actually join the recruiting service. So they do an assessment, send me their CV, and we're doing a pre-interview, let's say, and then I'm looking for them or I'm getting in touch with companies, so I have then jobs where they can apply through me, and basically get a quick way of getting access through what they have learned in the academy. So that's why I made it just for academy students. It's not that easy to say, I have to say, because a lot of companies are looking for senior roles right now. It's really there are a lot of senior roles or full professional roles where it's hard for a junior or for somebody who's just changing from analyst to engineer to get into. So it's not easy, but nevertheless, doing my best, trying to help people.
That's awesome.
Let me ask this: so I've had a few friends, actually, some of them are mutual friends of Joe's, who've gone to Berlin, and it seems like in Berlin you can kind of go and just speak English. Like people just expect to speak English in the office, and maybe it's not quite like that in the rest of Germany. I don't know. Is that a fair assessment? I know they kind of went and learned on the job. So
yeah, you can learn on the job.
Yeah,
that's absolutely true, and you can usually. I know it from my time at Bosch. It's completely normal. You talk English, and the most stuff that you write or that I wrote was always in English because I had to work with other countries. But the stuff is, what I meant is, like when you're in the same room, like you're fresh there, you want to get the hang of the team, and you want to participate. Very often people are together, they're not going to speak English, because two Germans talking to each other, it's like, why would you talk English? Right? So and then you're missing out on that conversation, which might be first interesting for you, or give you an opportunity to actually then later participate on that, ask questions around that. Hey, I heard you were talking about this. I haven't understood this before. Can you give me some tips on that, and so on? Like that's something like that you don't have in the US. Of course, everybody's speaking English, so it's a lot easier for foreigners.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
cool.
I know both France and Germany have visa programs specific to tech as well. I haven't looked into this for a while, but it seems like those are still around. Obviously, COVID complicates anything around immigration at the moment.
Yeah, I was looking at a golden visa the other day for Portugal, actually. So, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I think I'm not sure about that, but I think the European, to get a European visa, work visa, is a lot easier than in the US.
Oh, it's insane here. Like there's lotteries, and I think depending on where you're from, it might be like almost 100 years for some people. I'm not joking at all, actually. So it's insane. So, but if you're a billionaire, then come to the US and buy a.
I think for business owners who bring the business in, it's simpler.
It can be, yeah.
But for somebody who is searching for a job, it's harder.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's really hard. Like we teach at a university, and a lot of our students, come from other places than the U.S. And I mean, I feel bad for them because in some, when they graduate, the clock starts ticking. You have to go get a job, or you have to go back. There's not an option. I guess you could stay here illegally, but that's not fun. So
I don't think that's a wise decision.
We don't recommend it.
No. If there's one piece of advice we're giving, don't take that one.
Actually, they're on the clock. I know. I had a coaching student last year who actually was in that position where he needed to get a job quick, no matter what. Nice.
Yeah. Well, cool. Coming up on time here. Actually, got to run to a client. But for people who want to learn more about you, Andreas, how would they do that?
Check out my LinkedIn or my YouTube, Andreas Kretz, or just go to learndataengineering.com, and there I have the links to everything and the academy and so on.
Sick.
So
it's always a pleasure to chat with you, man. I feel like we're kindred spirits, and it's interesting because I think we're trying to solve the same problem. Obviously in different ways. I think we focus in different areas, but it's all the same thing at the end of the day. And I think just helping people learn data engineering, it needs to happen. There's just not enough data engineers, for one thing. So kind of need to help get those numbers up a bit. Well, awesome, man. Thanks for having you on. Have to have you on again soon. Next week we have Bruno Aziza. He's the head of data and analytics at Google Cloud. If you know Bruno, he's a character. He does a lot of his videos from his Tesla when he's parked, obviously, not when he's driving.
Autopilot.
So maybe if Bruno, for next week, if we could make a request, you do it on autopilot. As you're driving down to the one, that'd be great. Just kidding. But yeah, so he'll be on. And then the week after, we got George Firikin, who's going to be on. And then Scott Taylor the week after. So we got some hitters. And stay tuned for some more announcements on guests. But thanks to the audience. Great questions, a lot of input. Yeah, see you next week. So thanks, Andreas.
Bye-bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.